me a lesson. But Lee ignored such calls for vengeance, writes Pollard, who provided no evidence of or specifics about the alleged barbarity of the Union forces. Jefferson Davis leveled the charge of unconscionable brutality 15 years later in his description of Colonel Benjamin Grierson's diversionary raid from the northern border of Mississippi to the interior of the state. Among the expeditions for pillage and arson, Davis charged, this stands prominent for savage outrages against defenseless women and children, constituting a record alike unworthy of a soldier and gentleman. Grierson's 3 cavalry regiments kept Mississippians on edge for perhaps 17 days, causing General Pemberton to send thousands of troops to find and intercept them, diverting rebel attention away from Grant's movements, their main mission, and destroyed railroad tracks, stations, and rolling stock, but there's no record of pillaging, and certainly not of attacking or bothering any civilians, let alone women and children. Nevertheless, Davis's lie took root. It's only fairly recently in the 20th century that the concept of total war has been applied to the Civil War. According to Mark Neely Jr., the term was first used in 1948 by John Walters in an article about Sherman for the Journal of Southern History and was quickly adopted by the famed Civil War historian T. Harry Williams. His book, Lincoln and His Generals, began with this assertion: the Civil War was the first of the modern total wars. Other prominent Civil War historians followed Williams down that path. For example, in 1986, James McPherson commented that by 1864, a group of generals, including Grant, Sherman, and Sheridan, had emerged to top commands in the North with a firm grasp on the need for coordinated defenses in all theaters, a concept of the total war strategy necessary to win this conflict, the skills to carry out the strategy, and the relentless, even ruthless determination to keep pressing it despite a high cost of casualties until the South surrendered unconditionally. McPherson explains, the kind of conflict the Civil War had become merits the label of total war. To be sure, Union soldiers did not set out to kill Southern civilians. General Sherman, after all, in his campaign, his March to the Sea, destroyed property, while Allied bombers in World War II destroyed hundreds of thousands of lives as well. But the strategic purpose of both was the same: to eliminate the resources and break the will of the people to sustain war. Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors. The reality is that the North won by a hard war, not total war. Total war, defined by the wanton killing of massive numbers of civilians, has a long and brutal history, and it doesn't just begin with the Civil War. It was waged by Genghis Khan, Tamerlane, the Romans against the Carthaginians, Catholics and Protestants in the 30 Years' War, Germans in the First and Second World Wars, and the Russians and the Japanese in World War II. The Civil War largely doesn't belong in this category. The methods, not the strategic purpose, make a conflict a total war. Unlimited large-scale attacks on civilians, like those in London, Coventry, Dresden, Berlin, Tokyo, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and countless other cities in World War II, are absent from the Civil War. If Sherman's attacks on property had also included a large number of executions of civilians, they could have been accused of total war. With the intentions of eliminating enemy resources and breaking the will of the people, which are logical goals of virtually any war, doesn't make it a total war. Most of the killings of civilians during the Civil War occurred in Missouri, Kansas, the Appalachian section of many Confederate states, and Texas. They generally were carried out by civilians engaged in local guerrilla warfare and not by organized military units. The worst was the execution of about 150 men and boys in Lawrence, Kansas, in 1863 by William Quantrill's pro-Confederate raiders. Not long after, in 1864, Bloody Bill Anderson executed 24 unarmed Union soldiers pulled from a train, and he slaughtered 127 men in a pursuing militia posse, including the captured and wounded. Perhaps the most common killings of innocents by military units were the executions of surrendering or surrendered black Union troops and their officers in many places, including Fort Pillow, Milliken's Bend, Saltville, the Crater, and Poison Springs, Arkansas. Neither Confederate nor Union regular armies, however, engaged in large-scale campaigns that include the deliberate killing of innocent civilians. Civil War armies engaged in hard war, but not total war. That evidence deserves more detailed examination. What did Sherman's army really do in Mississippi, Georgia, and the Carolinas in 1864-1865? In early 1864, his army lived off the countryside in his Meriden campaign, a dress rehearsal for the March to the Sea. As they stormed through Georgia later that year, 60,000 Union troops destroyed railroads, torched cotton bales, emptying corn cribs, smokehouses, and seized hogs, horses, and mules. Most significantly, they freed thousands and thousands of enslaved laborers along their path. Sherman's large army was able to live off the country between Atlanta and Savannah because Sherman had studied an 1860 census report on the population, livestock, and agricultural production of each Georgia county he passed through. He later said, "No military expedition was ever based on sounder or surer data." His march to the sea is described in the Oxford Encyclopedia of the Civil War. Sherman's men were under orders to forage liberally on the country during the march. That is, to seize food, fodder, and horses needed to sustain the army. Foraging parties organized daily in each regiment, performing their task with a vengeance. Self-appointed or especially ruthless foragers, known as bummers, were little more than ransacking thieves as they plundered the possessions of rich and poor, of slaves as well as their masters. At a cost of just 2,000 casualties, Sherman's march across Georgia crippled much of the war-making potential and morale of the Confederacy. His army accounted for some $100 million in property damage as it brought the war home with frightening reality to Confederate civilians. The Lost Cause or Pollard had to stretch the evidence to speculate that civilians were killed in the March to the Sea. He described massive damage to, or theft of, barns, crops, furniture, pianos, jewelry, sorghum barrels, and other property. Labeling Sherman's property destruction savage warfare, Pollard continued, "If a property owner escaped and was hiding in a thicket, this was evidence that he was a skulking rebel, and most likely some ruffian, in a zeal to get rid of such vipers, gave him a dose of lead which cured him of his succession tendencies." So that's not very much to support allegations of total war. Sherman's army continued its destructive progress through the Carolinas in 1865. His men particularly hated South Carolina, the birthplace of secession, and they probably destroyed more property there than anywhere else. The notorious burning of one-third of the capital city, Columbia, was a combined work of evacuating Confederates, burning large quantities of cotton in the streets, high winds blowing up, and drunken Union soldiers, before Sherman had them stopped. All these actions were consistent with Sherman's statements that we are not only fighting hostile armies, but a hostile people, and must make them feel the hard hand of war. There are few reports of rapes or killings of civilians perpetrated by Sherman's army. A recent study of the relationship between his soldiers and Southern women excoriates the soldiers for entering bedrooms and parlors, as well as seizing personal treasures and letters, in an effort to humiliate and demoralize elite white women along their route. But there's no mention of rape or murder. Being caught in the path of Sherman's army was harrowing, but it wasn't total war. What did Sheridan's troops do in Shenandoah Valley in 1864-1865? They burned barns, silos, crops, and some houses. They stripped the valley of livestock and foodstuffs that had been used to support Confederate troops throughout the war. There was no program to kill civilians, and at most only a few of them died. 2 years later, Pollard harshly described Sheridan's destruction of agriculture. Of this and other like atrocities of the enemy, there has been attempted a very weak excuse to the effect that if the private property of the inhabitants of the Confederacy had not been destroyed, it might have been converted to the uses of the belligerent government and helped to sustain it. Once for all, it may be said that this excuse excludes every sentiment of humanity in war and may be logically carried to the last extremity of savage warfare. Understatement wasn't a characteristic of Pollard's work. Overstatement became a basis for such myths. Sherman's and Sheridan's destructive sweeps through the South occurred late in the conflict when the North realized it would have to wage hard war to win. Grant realized after Bloody Shiloh in 1862 that a decisive Union victory wouldn't bring down the Confederate governor without complete conquest. In his memoirs, he wrote, "Up to that time it had been the policy of our army, certainly of that portion commanded by me, to protect the property of the citizens whose territory was invaded. After this, however, I regarded it as humane to both sides to protect the persons of those found at their homes, but to consume everything that could be used to support or supply armies. Such supplies within the reach of Confederate armies are regarded as much contraband as arms or ordnance stores. The destruction was accomplished without bloodshed and tended to the same result as the destruction of armies. Promiscuous pillaging, however, was discouraged and punished. This policy, hard war, not total war, was followed with few exceptions for the balance of the war." The North's approach to slavery exemplifies the movement toward hard war. Lincoln rejected appeals for emancipation for more than a year into the war. He made several officers of compensated emancipation to the border states, Delaware, Kentucky, Maryland, and Missouri, to secure their continued allegiance to the Union. When the need for more Union soldiers and the need to deplete the labor force of the South outweighed the border state concerns, the president issued his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation in September 1862 and his final proclamation on January 1, 1863. Even though Lincoln's emancipation of Southern slaves fulfilled his dual goal and was clearly intended to eliminate the resources and break the will of the Southern people to sustain war, it wasn't an act of total war. It did result in an increasingly overwhelming loss of property, quote-unquote, by the Southern people, and culminated in the 13th Amendment, which Congress passed and sent to the states for ratification in January 1865. In tandem with Lincoln's anti-slavery moves, Congress passed 2 confiscation acts to deprive the enemy of property. The Confederate Congress passed similar legislation. The Civil War was a mighty scourge, as Lincoln called it, but despite the best efforts of mythmakers, it was not America's introduction to total war. The mass killings of civilians that did take place were the work of Confederate sympathizers. War isn't pretty, but claims that the Union waged total war are a bit off the mark. Well, I think that wraps up this episode, so what I would say is, it's not that generals changed a lot. There were some that swapped in and out that were more effective than other generals. Grant was a much more effective general than earlier Union generals. But competencies of generals didn't change. I think their tactics just changed in the evolving face of what the war was, where it became necessary to wage a harder war from the Union side in order to win, and the Confederacy fought a more defensive war than an offensive war. So it wasn't so much the abilities, but the circumstances that I would say changed. So I hope this answers the question. All right. Well, that wraps up our exploration of the past for this episode. First off, I want to give a shout out to the Spy Masters for the Knowlton's Rangers. Vic Austin, Chris, Rob Matlock, Alan Baker, Beverly Engel, Jake Harrington, Todd Warren, William Ivey, Joyce Normant, Tyler from Colorado, Josh Reddick, Daniel Lawson, Marlene, Michael, Tim Clark, David Powell, Moondoggy from Ohio, Melissa, Christopher Main, Carl from Norway, and Baron Fraser. I'll explain what that is in a second. If you like the show and want to help it grow, there are 4 easy ways for you to do it. 1, like and subscribe to the show on the podcast player of your choice. This helps spread the word about the show. 2, join our Facebook group. Here we can keep the discussion going about new episodes, and you can talk about what you like and didn't like. And you can find this group if you just search for History Unplugged on Facebook. 3, we have an online store with t-shirts, phone covers, and other accessories featuring awesomely bad history puns that were crowdsourced by you, the audience. And you can find that if you go to public.com and look for History Unplugged, or you just go to historyonthenet.com and look for our store there. 4, and this is really the best way to dive deep with History Unplugged, and that's to become one of the Knowlton's Rangers. If you know your American history, you know the Knowlton's Rangers were an elite spy and reconnaissance group in the American Revolutionary War, but it's also the name of the membership program of History Unplugged. You can join at 3 levels. If you join at the level of Scout, you can hear all the episodes of History Unplugged completely ad-free and get early access to new episodes, at least a week early. If you join at the Intelligence Officer level, you get special bonus episodes, like a 10-part series on the World War II hero Audie Murphy, a multi-part series called Ottoman Lives about different people in the Ottoman Empire, and a series called Rendezvous with Death that looks at biographical profiles of Americans who went to fight in World War I before America entered the war. The last level is Spy Master, where you get all that stuff, but you also get 3 hardcover history books, Forging a President, How the Wild West Created Teddy Roosevelt, Race to the Top of the World, Richard Byrd and the First Flight to the North Pole, and The Last Fighter Pilot, the true story of the final combat mission of World War II. Another bonus is, you can choose a history topic for me to focus on for an entire episode that can go up to an hour, and I'll answer whatever question you have for me, and you get a shout out at the end of each episode. If you want to learn how to become a member of the Knowlton's Rangers, go to patreon.com/unplugged. That's patreon.com/unplugged. All right, well, that is all for my spiel. Thanks for listening to the History Unplugged podcast, from ancient Greece to the Cold War and everything else in between. See you next time.